The moment betrayal enters your life, something inside you doesn't just break. It quietly rewrites who you are. And the strange truth is, most people never realize that betrayal doesn't destroy you. It reconstructs you in ways you don't notice until much later. It usually begins in silence. A message left unanswered. A glance that feels different. A promise that starts to sound unfamiliar. And then one day, the truth arrives. Not loudly, but precisely enough to split your world into before and after. In that exact moment, you don't just lose a person. You lose a version of reality you trusted with your entire identity. But here's what makes betrayal so dangerous. It doesn't just hurt your emotions. It alters your perception of people, of trust, and even of yourself. It changes the way you interpret kindness, silence, laughter, and distance. At first, you think time will heal it. You think understanding will make it easier. You think closure will close it. But what if none of that is true? What if betrayal is not an event, but a psychological turning point that silently reshapes your nervous system, your instincts, and your emotional memory? Because after betrayal, you are never reacting to the present anymore. You are reacting to the past, bleeding into every new moment. And this is where things become deeply unsettling. Why do some people become emotionally detached after betrayal, while others become overly attached, desperate to never lose again? Why does the same experience turn one person cold and another person fragile? And why does betrayal sometimes feel like it didn't just happen to you, but like it created a new version of you? Psychologists, philosophers, and ancient thinkers all pointed toward the same hidden truth, but never in the same language. Carl Jung called it the shadow forming. Marcus Aurelius saw it as the test of perception. Nietzsche described it as the moment truth destroys illusion. And Buddha would say it is the moment attachment reveals itself as suffering. But none of these explanations fully capture what you feel in the moment it happens, because betrayal doesn't just hurt, it reveals, and what it reveals about you is something you may not be ready to see. And by the end of this journey, you will understand why betrayal changes you forever, and why, even though it feels like an ending, it is actually the beginning of something far more unsettling and far more powerful. But to understand that, we first have to go where most people avoid looking, into the first fracture of the mind after betrayal. There is always a single moment after betrayal where everything feels unreal, not because you don't understand what happened, but because your mind refuses to accept that the person you trusted was capable of it. This is where the psychological fracture begins. At first, the brain enters denial, not as weakness, but as protection. It tries to rewrite small details. It searches for alternative explanations. It builds invisible stories just to delay the collapse of meaning. Because meaning is what keeps your world stable. And betrayal destroys meaning before it destroys anything else. But here's what most people never realize. Betrayal is not just about the act. It is about the identity shift it forces upon you. You don't just think, they hurt me. You think, I was wrong about everything. And that second sentence is where the damage begins to deepen. Because suddenly, the mind turns inward. It doesn't just question the other person. It questions your judgment, your memory, your instincts. And slowly, trust stops feeling external and becomes something you are afraid to give even to yourself. A man who once believed in loyalty starts analyzing every conversation. A woman who once trusted easily starts reading silence like danger. Not because they want to, but because the brain learns from emotional shock faster than from logic. And this is where Carl Jung's idea of the shadow becomes relevant. He suggested that intense emotional wounds force parts of the psyche to split off, unprocessed emotions, suppressed anger, hidden fear. After betrayal, you don't just become hurt, you become divided. One part of you wants to trust again. The other part begins building walls you don't consciously design. At first, this makes no sense, because you still laugh, still talk, still function. But internally, something fundamental has changed. The world no longer feels safe in the same way. And that's where everything changes. Because once safety is gone, perception becomes distorted. You start noticing patterns that may not even be there. A delayed reply feels like rejection. A change in tone feels like distance. Not because you are irrational, but because your nervous system is now trying to prevent history from repeating itself. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the soul becomes colored by its thoughts. But after betrayal, it is not just thoughts that color the soul. It is memory fused with emotion, constantly replaying itself in the background of your present. And here is the hidden truth most people never notice. After betrayal, you are not reacting to what people are doing. You are reacting to what someone else did to you before. And that means every new relationship, every new interaction becomes slightly contaminated by the past. This is why some people withdraw completely after betrayal. They don't stop caring, they stop believing interpretation is safe. Because interpretation once failed them. But there is another group, the ones who become hyper-attached. They don't trust less, they cling more. Not because they are weak, but because the mind tries to repair the past by overcorrecting the present. If they hold tighter, they believe they can prevent loss. But this creates a paradox. The fear of betrayal begins to shape behavior that unintentionally pushes people away. And so, without realizing it, betrayal does something extraordinary. It doesn't just break trust, it rewires the way trust is formed. And this rewiring leads us into something deeper, something darker, and something most people never consciously recognize. Because the real damage of betrayal doesn't happen when it occurs. It happens when you start remembering it, and that is where chapter 2 begins. Memory is supposed to preserve the past, but after betrayal, memory stops being a record and becomes a living force. It doesn't stay still. It moves. It replays, it distorts, it reinterprets. You remember a moment of kindness and suddenly wonder if it was real. You remember laughter and question whether it was manipulation. You remember love, and now it feels like a disguise you failed to see through. And this is where psychological pain becomes something far more complex than sadness, because sadness fades with time. But reconstructed memory does not. It evolves. Viktor Frankl, who survived unimaginable suffering, once said that between stimulus and response lies a space where meaning is created. But after betrayal, that space collapses. Meaning is no longer created freely. It is contaminated by fear, and this is the strange part. The mind starts replaying the betrayal not to suffer, but to prevent future suffering. It believes repetition equals protection. So it revisits the moment again and again, searching for clues it missed the first time. But in doing so, it becomes trapped in a loop where healing and pain become indistinguishable. A person might be sitting alone at night, calm on the surface, but internally, replaying a conversation from months ago, analyzing every pause, every word, every shift in tone. Not because they want to, but because the brain is trying to rewrite the past into something predictable. Nietzsche once suggested that humans prefer certainty over truth. And after betrayal, this becomes painfully visible. Even painful certainty feels safer than unpredictable trust. But here's the contradiction. The more you analyze the past, the less you are present in the future. And this is how betrayal quietly steals something even deeper than trust. It steals spontaneity, because now Every moment carries evaluation. Every smile is checked for authenticity. Every silence is inspected for meaning. At first, this seems like wisdom, like emotional intelligence, like growth. But in reality, it is hypervigilance disguised as awareness. And that's where most people get it wrong. They think they are becoming stronger, when in truth, they are becoming guarded against life itself. Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering. But after betrayal, attachment doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes attachment to control, to prediction, to certainty. You stop attaching to people and start attaching to outcomes. And yet, even this control fails, because life refuses to be predictable. And every time unpredictability returns, it triggers the original wound again. But what no one tells you is this: the memory of betrayal is not just emotional, it becomes physiological. Your body remembers what your mind tries to forget. And this is where the transformation deepens. There comes a point where you stop saying, "I was betrayed," and start realizing something more unsettling. I am not the same person anymore. And this is not imagination. It is psychological adaptation. After betrayal, the brain reorganizes priorities. Emotional safety becomes more important than emotional openness. Observation becomes more important than participation. Distance becomes more important than depth. You begin to notice it in small ways first. You pause before replying. You overthink tone. You read between lines that may not even exist. You start expecting disappointment before it arrives, not because you are pessimistic, but because your mind believes anticipation reduces shock. And this is where Epictetus becomes relevant. He taught that we are disturbed not by events, but by our interpretation of them. But after betrayal, interpretation becomes automatic, almost involuntary. The mind no longer waits for meaning, it assigns it instantly, often defensively, and slowly a new version of you emerges. Not fully healed, not fully broken, but adapted. And adaptation is not always healing. Sometimes it is survival disguised as personality. You may still laugh the same way, still talk the same way, still move through life appearing unchanged, but internally something has shifted permanently. You are no longer who you were before the fracture, and the strange truth is, most people around you will never notice, because betrayal changes the internal architecture, not the external expression. This is where many people feel isolated, even in relationships. Because they cannot explain what changed, they only feel it. And here is the hidden truth most people never articulate. After betrayal, you don't just lose trust in others, you lose innocence in perception. You start seeing patterns everywhere. You begin questioning sincerity. And while this can feel like awareness, it often becomes emotional exhaustion, because a mind that is always scanning for danger eventually forgets how to feel safe, even when danger is gone. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that external chaos should not disturb internal peace. But betrayal flips this equation. Internal chaos begins to project outward. The world no longer feels neutral, it feels suspicious. And so, the question becomes unavoidable. Is this new version of you stronger or simply more guarded? The answer is not simple. Because strength built through betrayal carries both wisdom and wounds. You understand people more deeply now, but you also trust them less easily. You see truth more clearly, but you also question sincerity more often, and this duality becomes your new identity. But identity is not the final stage of betrayal. There is something deeper still, because eventually the mind stops reacting and starts transforming meaning itself, and that is where Chapter 4 begins. At some point, the questions change. It is no longer, "Why did this happen?" It becomes, "Why did this change me so much?" And this question leads into the deepest layer of human psychology, meaning because betrayal forces a confrontation with meaning itself. Without meaning, pain is just suffering. But with meaning, pain becomes transformation. This is where Viktor Frankl's insight becomes powerful. He believed that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. But meaning is not given, it is constructed under pressure. And betrayal applies that pressure in the most intense way. You begin to realize something unsettling. The person who betrayed you did not just affect your relationship. They altered your philosophy of life. Nietzsche said, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." But what is often left unsaid is that it also makes you different, and difference is not always comfort. Sometimes it is alienation from your former self. But here's the turning point. When you stop asking why it happened to you and start asking what it changed in you, the pain begins to shift shape, not disappear, but transform. You begin to see patterns in yourself you never noticed before, expectations you never questioned, attachments you never examined, and slowly the betrayal becomes less about them and more about what it exposed in you. This is not blame, this is awareness. And awareness is the beginning of freedom. Buddha once pointed toward the idea that suffering arises from ignorance. Not ignorance of the world, but ignorance of the self. Betrayal removes that ignorance violently. It forces you to see where you were emotionally dependent, where you projected meaning, where you mistook possibility for certainty. And this realization is painful, but also clarifying, because once you see clearly, you cannot unsee, and that changes everything. You see patterns, you see cycles, you see yourself more clearly than before. And so, the final question becomes, do you remain guarded forever? Or do you learn to trust again, knowing what you now know? And this is where everything converges into one final truth. Betrayal does not end when the act ends. It ends when its meaning changes. For most people, it becomes a scar they carry quietly, influencing decisions without permission, shaping trust without warning. But for those who go deeper into its psychological and philosophical layers, it becomes something else entirely, a mirror, not of what others did, but of what you became capable of understanding. And understanding changes everything. Because once you see that betrayal is not just a violation of trust, but a collapse of illusion, you begin to realize something profound. You were never only loving a person, you were loving a version of reality built on expectation. And when that reality broke, what remained was truth. Uncomfortable, sharp, but real. And truth, no matter how painful, does something extraordinary. It grounds you. It removes fantasy. It removes blind projection. It removes the fragile constructions that once felt like certainty. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the obstacle becomes the path. And betrayal is exactly that kind of obstacle. Not because it is meant to harm you, but because it forces you to see differently. You do not return to who you were before. That version no longer exists. But something else emerges, something more aware, more cautious, more thoughtful, more real, and perhaps more human. Because to be human is not to avoid betrayal. It is to survive it without letting it define your capacity to feel, to trust, or to grow. And maybe the deepest truth of all is this: betrayal changes you forever, not because it breaks you, but because it removes the version of you that could still believe without questioning. And what replaces it is not emptiness, it is awareness. And awareness once gained never fully disappears. It stays with you in silence, guiding you, warning you, teaching you, until one day you realize something unexpected. You are no longer afraid of betrayal the way you once were, not because it cannot happen again, but because you finally understand what it truly is. Not an ending, not a curse, but a transformation you had no choice but to undergo. And in that realization, the pain does not vanish, but it stops owning you. And for the first time, you see clearly. That betrayal did not just change your life, it changed your way of seeing life itself.